I was standing alone in Terminal D at Chicago O'Hare, the kind of place that always feels like it belongs to everyone but you. I could hear kids dragging their tiny Spider-Man suitcases behind them, couples bickering about gate numbers, and somewhere far off, the endless overhead drone about mask mandates and delays. But all I could really notice was my own suitcase, the faded brown one my wife, Gloria, had bought me for our 25th anniversary years before she passed. Its handle felt smoother now, worn down by all those trips I'd planned for a family that seemed to get smaller every year. I checked my phone for the third time in 10 minutes. No new messages. It was 8:47 a.m., and the flight to Maui, the one I'd spent months planning, was boarding in 30 minutes. The vacation was supposed to be a surprise for my son, Evan, his wife Brittany, and my grandson Tyler. A last shot at togetherness before age and distance made it impossible. For weeks, I'd pictured how it would feel to watch the sun set with them on a real beach. No more video calls and missed birthdays. When the phone finally buzzed, I almost laughed out loud with relief, already half smiling as I swiped to answer. For a split second, I let myself believe he was stuck in security, apologizing for making his old man wait. But all I heard on the other end was that weird echo you get from airport phones, and the emptiness behind Evan's voice. "Dad, hey, listen, you can just head home. Don't wait. We're already at the gate. Actually, the plane's about to taxi out." There was a strange, drawn-out pause, and then a low, muffled laugh in the background. Brittany. The giggle wasn't even mean, just matter of fact, like she was announcing the weather. "It's just, this trip, we wanted it to be special. Just the three of us. No offense, Dad, but it's better this way. You understand, right?" I stared out at the moving sidewalk, barely able to process the words as people rushed by, their faces all blurry and indistinct. I must have looked like a man waiting for a punch that never comes, left standing there holding his own confusion. For a second, I almost said something, almost demanded an explanation. But the line went dead. That was it. It took me a minute to realize how tightly I was clutching the suitcase handle, the sharp edge biting into my palm. I could feel my pulse in my neck, a quiet, contained anger boiling up from somewhere deep, something I hadn't felt since the night Gloria died, and I found myself alone with the bills, the empty rooms, and the echo of my own voice in the house. I turned slowly, watching my own reflection in the glass wall. Gray hair, heavy eyes, the kind of face you see on bank commercials about retirement accounts. I wanted to smash that glass, but instead, I did what I always do. I started moving. My legs felt heavy, like I'd run a marathon and lost, but I forced myself toward the taxi stand, weaving through the crowds. Each step felt like another year of my life, a life that had been poured, drop by drop, into Evan and his family. The sky outside was a flat, gunmetal gray, the wind cutting through my jacket as if I wasn't even there. I stepped off the curb and flagged down a yellow cab. The driver, a young guy with a bear's cap and a thick accent, barely glanced at me as he loaded my suitcase in the trunk. "Rough day, sir?" he asked, his tone light, almost rehearsed. I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice. I just slid into the back seat, letting the vinyl stick to my thighs, breathing in the faint scent of cigarettes and stale coffee. For a while, the cab just hummed through the city, the silence stretching out between us, broken only by the rhythmic click of the turn signal and the low rumble of trucks on I-90. As we passed the old Wrigley building, I let my mind wander back through the last few years. The missed calls, the polite texts on Father's Day, the time Evan forgot my birthday and made up for it with a generic Amazon gift card. I thought about all the little things I'd done without ever asking for thanks. The baseball camp, the first car, the private school tuition. I remembered the nights I'd worked overtime at the plant, the Thanksgiving dinners where I carved the turkey while everyone else scrolled through their phones. Gloria always said family was about showing up, about being steady, even when nobody noticed. But what if showing up is the only thing you have left? The driver finally cleared his throat. "Where to?" I blinked, the question dragging me out of myself. "Just home," I said, my voice a rasp. "Take me to 1821 West Franklin." As the miles slid by, I watched the city recede in the rearview mirror, the skyline shrinking, the glass towers giving way to weather-beaten row houses and half-abandoned strip malls. I could see my old neighborhood already, the cracked sidewalk out front, the tiny American flag that Gloria had planted in the flower bed, faded from too many seasons. The closer we got, the more I could feel the ache settling in my chest, a hollow pressure that made it hard to breathe. When the cab stopped at the curb, I paid without waiting for change, grabbing my suitcase and trudging up the steps. The house felt colder than usual, as if it had been waiting for bad news. Inside, I hung my coat on the peg, pausing to stare at the faded family portrait in the entryway. There we were, all four of us, back when even smiles came easy. My fingers brushed over Gloria's face. For a split second, I almost expected her to tell me it would be all right, that it was just a misunderstanding, that Evan would show up any minute with an apology. But the only sound was the ticking of the old kitchen clock, steady and indifferent. I wandered into the living room, dropping onto the couch, the same sagging spot I'd sat in 1,000 times before. My hands were shaking, and for a moment I wanted to smash something, to yell until the walls cracked, to just feel anything other than this heavy, bottomless emptiness. Instead, I forced myself to breathe, slow and deep, staring at the pile of mail on the coffee table. Bank statements, credit card offers, the kind of paperwork that always used to seem urgent, now just background noise to a life that felt suddenly smaller. I picked up the envelope from First National, my name printed in blue ink, and held it for a long moment, the edge digging into my thumb. I could still hear Brittany's laugh, soft but cutting, as if she was already rewriting the story of who I was, making me the punchline to a joke I didn't understand. And Evan, God, he sounded almost relieved, like this was a burden lifted, not a knife in the back. But I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just sat there, letting the weight of it all press down, until the only thing left was resolve. Something snapped inside me, not with anger but with clarity. I'd spent my whole life believing that love meant sacrifice, that forgiveness was always the right answer. But maybe sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself, for the memory of a wife who believed in you, for the old man in the mirror, is to stop giving people the rope to hang you with. That's when the idea came to me, as clear and sharp as ice water. A plan, forming in the quiet, growing with every heartbeat. I was done being the fool, done letting my kindness be mistaken for weakness. They thought they could just erase me. They thought I'd disappear quietly, a ghost with a pension and a pile of old memories. But I had one last card to play. And if there's one thing Evan should have learned by now, it's that his father never quits, not when it counts. The phone sat heavy in my palm. My fingers hovered over his contact. For a moment I almost called, almost begged for an explanation, a second chance. But instead, I scrolled past his name to something more important. The bank, the lawyer, the people who could help me make things right once and for all. Outside, the wind rattled the window, the first drops of rain starting to patter against the glass. I watched them, tracing the patterns as they slid down, each drop another memory, another promise broken. Somewhere out there, Evan and Brittany were boarding a plane, thinking they'd won, thinking they were finally free of the old man with too many stories. But nothing was finished yet, not by a long shot. And for the first time in years, I felt a sliver of anticipation cut through the numbness. A cold, electric certainty that this was just the beginning. The ride home from O'Hare felt endless, the rain streaking across the cab's windows, turning the city outside into a smeared, unrecognizable world. I kept looking at my own hands in my lap, the way they trembled just a little, a reminder that shock isn't always loud. Sometimes, it just seeps into your bones and makes everything feel heavier than it is. The driver's radio played quietly, some oldie station, and I caught snatches of lyrics about heartbreak and starting over. Every time I thought about Evan's voice on the phone, or Brittany's laughter, God, that sound, I felt something twist inside me. If I closed my eyes, I could almost hear Gloria's voice, gentle but firm, telling me to breathe, to get myself together, to remember who I was before the disappointments set in. She would have hated this silence. When the cab finally rolled to a stop outside my house, I almost didn't recognize it for a second. The porch light was out, probably the bulb again. The flag on the stoop was sodden from the rain, colors running, as if the house itself was mourning. I paid the driver and hauled my suitcase up the steps, the wheels bumping against the old wooden boards. I paused before going in, listening to the sound of the city winding down. There were no voices in the house to welcome me home, just the low creak of the door on its hinges and the tick of the thermostat warming up the living room. The silence felt enormous, filling every corner. It's funny how a place you know so well can suddenly feel strange. I wandered through the rooms, flicking on lights, touching the back of the worn couch, the old brass lamp, as if I were reassuring myself that I still existed here, that this was still my life. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt coffee, and there was a stack of unopened mail on the counter, mostly junk and the odd bill. My hands went to work out of habit, sorting, tossing, tearing open envelopes without really reading them. My mind wasn't there. It was drifting, circling the airport. The empty promises, the slow-motion realization that I'd been erased from something I'd spent decades building. I tried to anchor myself in the routines that always brought me comfort, but nothing fit quite right. I pulled out a pan and made scrambled eggs, even though I wasn't hungry. I stared at the food, fork in hand, feeling each bite settle in my stomach like a stone. I washed up and looked out the window, the world outside lit up by passing cars, neighbors coming home from their own dinners, families arguing or laughing, people with somewhere to be. I wondered what it would be like to just get in my car and drive, keep going until everything I'd ever known was a memory behind me. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled the old photo album from the shelf. It was one of those thick leather-bound books, worn at the edges. The first pages were photos from when Evan was a kid. His gap-toothed grin at Little League, his arms thrown around Gloria and me at the county fair, a sunburn peeling on his nose. There were years in those pages, moments of genuine joy and sacrifice, things you think you'll never forget but somehow do. I traced my fingers over each picture, remembering the feel of Evan's small hand in mine, the smell of popcorn and engine grease, Gloria's laughter echoing across the backyard as the sprinklers came on and soaked us all. But underneath those memories was another current, colder and darker. It was the steady drip of all the things I'd given, not just the obvious ones. A down payment for his first car, tuition checks sent directly to his college, late-night wire transfers when unexpected emergencies came up. It was the smaller things too. Gas money, groceries, sacrifices that didn't get photos or thank-you cards. Each memory felt a little less bright as I recalled how, over the years, Evan's calls became briefer, his visits rarer, his tone shifting from warmth to obligation. I remembered the year Gloria died, how I threw myself into making sure Evan and Brittany felt supported, hoping that if I just kept showing up, kept being the steady hand, I'd never have to face this kind of loneliness. My thoughts kept circling back to the last Thanksgiving, when Evan and Brittany had come late, left early, and spent most of their time scrolling through their phones at the table. Tyler had barely spoken to me, too busy with some game on his tablet. When I asked Evan if he'd want to help decorate the tree with me, he just shrugged and said, "Maybe next year, Dad." Even then, I'd made excuses for him. Work was hard, parenting was harder, and God knows, family life was never simple. I used to believe that love, real love, could absorb all the small cuts and still hold together. But now, in the harsh light of Evan's betrayal at the airport, I saw it all differently. I started replaying the little moments, noticing the way Brittany would glance at Evan with barely hidden impatience, how they always seemed to be talking about finally having some space and not being tied down. I remembered the day Evan had asked me, with a straight face, if I'd mind adding him and Brittany to my bank account, just in case of emergencies. How quick he was to assure me that it was just a formality, that he'd never touch it without asking. That night I barely slept. I kept hearing Brittany's laughter, sharp and careless, and Evan's words, each syllable erasing a part of the father I thought I'd been. I paced the house, passing from room to room, counting bills and old keepsakes, as if I could tally up the worth of a lifetime spent giving. My own reflection in the hall mirror looked like a stranger. Older, thinner, someone who'd been carved out by disappointment and grief. The next morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone for a long time. I thought about calling Evan. I imagined demanding an apology, some kind of reckoning, but the more I pictured it, the more hollow it sounded. I realized then that the person I needed to talk to was gone. The boy who once believed I could fix anything had vanished, replaced by a man who saw me as little more than a faded photograph and a line of credit. I spent the day in a kind of fog, but by late afternoon something inside me began to shift. I started gathering paperwork, making copies of everything, bank records, the deed to the house, my will. I wanted to know exactly where I stood, exactly how much I'd given. It wasn't just about the money. It was about dignity, about not being the punchline anymore. As I sifted through statements and receipts, I started to see a pattern. It was right there in black and white. Every large withdrawal labeled for family, every bill paid for emergencies, every wire transfer to Evan and Brittany's account. I felt anger, but under it, a strange calm began to settle in. There was clarity in seeing the truth, even if it hurt. Sitting there in the fading light, I felt the faintest sense of anticipation. Not hope exactly, but resolve. I remembered the way Gloria would always encourage me to stand up for myself, even when it was easier to keep the peace. Maybe this was the moment she meant. I wasn't going to let them erase me. Not this time. I made a list. I wrote down every major sacrifice, every broken promise. I made a note to call the bank in the morning, to ask exactly what my rights were. I thought about the house, about what it meant to keep something for myself for once. I found myself staring at my own hands again, but they weren't trembling now. They were steady, purposeful. There was a plan forming, a quiet one, something that would finally set the record straight. That evening, as the city lights flickered on, I made dinner for myself, real food this time, not just eggs and toast. I sat at the table, eating slowly, the way Gloria used to tell me to, savoring each bite. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to show up. I let the quiet fill the house, not as an enemy, but as a witness to everything I'd endured, everything I was about to reclaim. Later, lying in bed, I looked at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and sighs of the old house, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. I felt the ache of betrayal, yes, but underneath it, something harder was taking shape. A sense that I was done being afraid of losing what little was left. I was done giving everything away for the illusion of family. The city slept, and for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of my old self. Someone capable of making hard choices, of drawing lines. I stared into the darkness, thinking not of the pain, but of what might come next. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, my story wasn't over yet. That morning, sunlight crept in through the kitchen window, but it did nothing to ease the sharp, unsettled energy humming through my chest. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter, staring at the way steam curled and vanished, trying to shake off the thick heaviness in my mind. The silence of the house felt different today. Less like peace, more like accusation. Every surface, every old photo on the wall, seemed to be reminding me of all the years I'd poured myself into this family. Every promise I'd kept, every comfort I'd given up for Evan and Brittany. Suddenly, I saw everything with new eyes. I walked the rooms, seeing my life as a trail of sacrifices, most of them invisible. I remembered skipping vacations to pay for Evan's braces, selling Gloria's car when the hospital bills piled up, agreeing to a second mortgage just to keep Tyler in that private school Brittany insisted on. I had always told myself that fathers were meant to build bridges, no matter how many times others chose not to cross them. But as I watched the sunlight settle on a forgotten birthday card, still sitting unopened on the mantel, a cold truth began to harden inside me. The details came in flashes. There was the memory of Evan, years ago, asking if he could just borrow my card for groceries, then calling the next week to say he needed help covering the electric bill, then Brittany texting that their rent check bounced. Again, I started making a list in my head. Every check I'd written, every call I'd answered at midnight, every loan that quietly became a gift. I'd been an open hand for so long, I didn't even notice when fingers started closing around my generosity. But it wasn't just money. It was the way Brittany rolled her eyes when she talked about the house I worked so hard to keep, muttering about the outdated kitchen, the old appliances, the faded couch. She acted like the only thing that mattered was how things looked from the outside, as if the comfort and safety built inside these walls was just background noise to her own ambition. Evan, for his part, just drifted along, always eager to please, always apologizing for not calling enough, always asking for one more thing. It stung, how little they seemed to care for the world I'd tried to give them. I opened my laptop and scrolled through my accounts, the numbers on the screen suddenly cold and glaring. I saw every transfer, every bill, every so-called family emergency. The bank statement from 2 days ago was the last straw. There, plain as day, was a charge from a luxury spa in Maui, one I hadn't made. My hands went cold, rage mixing with the icy shock. It wasn't just that they'd left me behind. They were still spending my money while I sat in this empty house, mourning the family I thought I had. The realization was sharp and unforgiving. I was not a father in their eyes, not really. I was a resource, an old man with a good pension and a bad habit of saying yes. I sat there, my coffee cooling beside me, feeling a sense of humiliation so deep it felt like it might hollow me out. All those years, I'd believed I was holding my family together, but I was only making it easier for them to pull away. In that quiet, something broke. I stopped thinking of myself as a victim. A plan began to form, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I owed it to Gloria's memory, and maybe to myself, to finally set a boundary. I stood, suddenly decisive, and reached for the phone. The call to the bank was brief but electric with finality. I explained what I needed. Cancel all secondary cards. Revoke every bit of access that Evan and Brittany had to my accounts. I told the woman on the other end, her name was Linda, she sounded patient and matter-of-fact, that I needed confirmation that my accounts were protected, that I alone had control. I answered her security questions, listened to her click through the necessary screens. The finality of it made me feel oddly calm, like stepping out into the cold and letting the shock clear your head. After hanging up, I sat for a long time, letting the silence return. This time, it didn't bother me. Instead, I felt something else, anticipation. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about ending the story the right way. I thought of Gloria again, of how she always said, "Love means knowing when to stop giving." I was ready to stop. I spent the rest of the morning sorting paperwork, gathering up every document that tied Evan and Brittany to this house, this life, this history. I thought about what I would say to them if they ever bothered to ask. I imagined Brittany's incredulous stare, the way Evan's voice always got small and childish when he didn't get his way. I realized I no longer cared about their reactions. All I wanted was the freedom to live the rest of my life on my terms, not as a supporting character in someone else's story. Around noon, the doorbell rang. A sharp, unexpected sound that broke the rhythm of my new resolve. I opened the door to find Mason standing there, his hands shoved in his pockets, a cautious half-smile on his face. Mason had been Evan's friend since high school, the kind of guy who was always borrowing tools, always a little too eager to help when it suited him. Today, he was nervous, glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting to be caught at something. I let him in, mostly out of habit, and we sat at the kitchen table. Mason cleared his throat, hesitating before finally blurting out, "Evan's worried. You know? He said you've been acting strange. He's, hoping you're okay." I looked at him, waiting for the real reason. Mason couldn't hold my gaze. He picked at a fraying spot on his jacket sleeve, clearly uncomfortable. "He, mentioned the money situation," Mason went on. "Brittany's really stressed. They didn't mean to leave you out of the trip, Mr. Callahan. It just happened." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Even now, they couldn't admit the truth. Couldn't face the reality that maybe, just maybe, they'd gone too far. I didn't answer Mason's half-hearted excuses. I told him, in the calmest voice I could manage, that things had changed, that I was done playing the fool, that I didn't owe anyone anything anymore. His expression shifted, confusion bleeding into frustration, but I stayed steady. When he left, I watched him cross the lawn, shoulders hunched against the wind, and I felt the first flicker of satisfaction. By late afternoon, I called my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Joyce I'd met through Gloria's old church group. We set up a meeting for the next morning to go over the will, the deed, and all the documents tying Evan and Brittany to my estate. I could hear the surprise in Joyce's voice when I told her I wanted everything changed. No explanations, no apologies. Just business. I realized, with a kind of relief, that I was finally done asking for permission to live my own life. That night, I sat on the porch as the sun set, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. I thought about all the moments I'd tried to buy peace, tried to buy love with another check, another concession, another compromise. But peace had never come, and love had slipped further away every year. Now the quiet didn't feel like a curse. Felt like freedom. Inside, I wrote a letter, just a few lines, nothing fancy. I told Evan and Brittany that things were changing, that I loved them but I wouldn't support them anymore. I folded the letter and set it on the hall table, not sure if I'd ever actually send it. But writing it made something final inside me. I looked at my hands, steady now, and knew I was ready for whatever came next. As the house grew dark, I moved room to room, locking doors, switching off lights, feeling the weight of the day settle in my bones. The ache of loss was still there, but beneath it was something new. A sense of resolve that maybe, just maybe, I could write the ending to my own story, one choice at a time. The next day arrived sharp and clear, with sunlight breaking through thin clouds and painting stripes across the floorboards in my hallway. I woke early, but there was no point in lingering in bed. Sleep had become a thin, restless thing. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed Evan's voice at the airport, Brittany's careless laughter, and the way my own kindness had been twisted into something small and embarrassing. My feet hit the cold floor with more purpose than usual. Today, I would take back control not just of my money or my house, but of who I was supposed to be. I got dressed slowly, every button and fold an act of steady defiance. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, not for comfort, but for the ritual of it, then sat in the kitchen, phone and notebook open, ready for business. I stared at my list, the hard edges of each bullet point reflecting a kind of new clarity. Call the lawyer, confirm with the bank, cancel every joint account and signature card, secure the house. It was all there, written in my own shaky script, the record of a man finally refusing to be erased. When I called Joyce, she picked up on the first ring. Her voice was brisk but warm, no nonsense in a way that told me she'd heard it all before. We set a time for me to come by her office that afternoon. I hung up and immediately dialed the bank, my fingers steady. This time, I was not asking for permission or forgiveness. I explained what I wanted with a kind of cool, unfamiliar authority, making sure there was no access left for Evan or Brittany. The woman on the other end worked quickly, confirming each step with a practiced patience. But I could tell she heard something in my tone. A man who was done being generous. When she told me it was all set, that the accounts were locked and only I had the keys, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It was only mid-morning, but I felt the first twinges of anticipation, a sense that something fundamental was shifting. It wasn't about hurting Evan or punishing Brittany. It was about drawing a line where one had never been drawn. After years of letting them cross my boundaries, I was learning, finally, how to keep a piece of myself for myself. Before heading to Joyce's office, I walked through the house. Each room was heavy with memory, but I forced myself to see them for what they were now. Not shrines to a lost past, but proof of all I'd built and protected. In the hallway, I found a stack of old mail addressed to Brittany, and a pair of sunglasses that didn't belong to me. The intrusion stung, but I took it as another reminder. My home was not a flophouse or a free ride. It was my last stand. At Joyce's office, everything smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. She was waiting at her desk with a neat stack of folders, and her eyes met mine with the kind of frank, practical kindness that makes you want to tell the whole story. I didn't, not really. I just said I wanted to make changes to my will, that my priorities had shifted, that I needed things to be crystal clear. She nodded, barely blinking, and got to work. Signing the documents was surprisingly easy, just a flurry of initials and signatures, each one erasing a little more of the old arrangement. I took my time, reading every line, and when we were done, Joyce looked at me as if seeing a new man. "You sure this is what you want?" she asked quietly. I met her gaze, steady and honest, and told her yes. I'd never been more certain of anything. On the way out, I ran into Mrs. Hampton, the office manager, who handed me a cup of coffee to go and squeezed my hand in a way that made me feel less alone. I took the long way home, walking through a side street, letting my mind settle into what I'd done. It was freeing and also terrifying. There was no undoing these steps. For the first time, I was acting not as Evan's father, not as Brittany's fallback plan, but as myself. Back at the house, I opened the closet and started packing up their things. Every pair of shoes, every sweater Brittany had left, every half-empty bottle of shampoo in the guest bathroom went into a box. The act was strangely cleansing. I labeled each one with their names and carried them to the porch, stacking them in the afternoon light. A sense of order returned to the house, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for me to reclaim them. I left a note on the top box. Simple, final, nothing cruel. Pick up by Friday. This is no longer your home. As I worked, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror by the front door. Sweat on my brow, hair wild, but my eyes clear. The man in the glass was not a victim. He was someone who had finally remembered how to protect himself. I changed the locks that evening. Pete, the locksmith from 2 blocks over, arrived just as the sky was turning orange. He worked quickly, chatting about local politics and the high school's losing streak, but I barely listened. My mind was on the satisfying snick of the new deadbolt sliding into place. When he handed me the fresh set of keys, their weight in my palm felt like an answer to a question I'd been too afraid to ask. It was close to dark when Mason showed up again, this time with a car idling at the curb and a look that tried for confident but came out uneasy. He wanted to talk, to make one last pitch on Evan's behalf, but I cut him off. I explained, without anger, just a kind of weary certainty, that Evan and Brittany would not be getting back in, that they'd have to stand on their own from here on out. Mason tried a few lines, tried to make it about family, about forgiveness. I shook my head. Family, I told him, isn't about what you can take, but what you give and what you respect. He left, more confused than angry. I locked the door behind him and stood in the silence for a long moment, letting it settle. It wasn't revenge. It was a reckoning. It was what happens when you refuse to be invisible any longer. Later, I wrote a short letter to Tyler. He was still young, still innocent in all this. I told him I loved him, that he was always welcome, that the door was never locked to him. I sealed the envelope and placed it with his things, hoping one day he'd understand. Maybe that was all I could do. That night, I took a walk through the neighborhood, letting the cool air sting my cheeks. Streetlights glowed on wet pavement, and a stray cat darted across the road. I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I'd cast off a burden, but because I'd chosen myself. When I got back, I sat on the porch for a while, listening to the city settle, to the small sounds of life going on. The porch light, which hadn't worked the night I returned from the airport, shone warm and steady overhead. Inside, I gathered the new keys, the signed will, the confirmation from the bank, and placed them in the top drawer of my desk. The symbols of a life reclaimed, however late. I poured myself a small whiskey, let the burn settle in my chest, and for the first time in a long time, looked forward to the next morning. Something in me had shifted permanently. It was not triumph, not victory over Evan or Brittany. It was acceptance. The story would go on, with or without them, but now I would be the one writing the ending. There was peace in that, and strength, and maybe a quiet kind of joy. Rain tapped gently at the windows, casting a silver haze over the street as I sat at the kitchen table, tracing circles on the rim of my coffee mug. The house was filled with a waiting sort of quiet, the kind that settles before something shifts. The boxes with Evan and Brittany's things were stacked neatly on the porch, their names written in block letters across the flaps, as final as a gravestone. I caught myself glancing at the clock more often, my heart ticking out a nervous, almost guilty rhythm. I wondered if I would falter, if I'd let anger or regret break my resolve. But each time the thought crept in, I'd remember Evan's voice at the airport, the sound of my own humiliation echoing in his absence. That memory hardened me like nothing else could. Evening brought a slow hush to the neighborhood, lights blinking on in window after window. I paced the living room, listening for the rumble of a cab, the shudder of suitcases over wet gravel. It was nearly 10 when headlights finally swept across the curtains, illuminating the porch and the boxes lined up like sentries. I stood, barely breathing, as the engine cut and doors slammed. I watched through the slit in the curtain as Evan and Brittany stepped out, tired and drawn, their hair tangled by a long flight, eyes hollowed by disappointment. They looked smaller than I remembered, like children coming home after a punishment they never expected. Evan dug in his pocket for keys, glancing up at the house as if it might welcome him back on its own. Brittany hung back, clutching her purse close, scanning the porch with quick, darting eyes. When Evan tried the lock, his confusion turned to frustration. I saw him twist harder, then stop abruptly, realization dawning. He tried again. The door didn't budge. I held my breath, watching from behind the curtain as he pounded on the door, his voice muffled by thick glass and years of resentment. "Dad, open up. Let's not do this. We're tired. It's cold out here." Each word seemed to echo off the walls, but I stayed still, hands knotted at my sides. Brittany moved closer, her voice sharp, insistent, but there was no triumph in it now. There was fear, and beneath that, a kind of disbelief. I caught fragments. "What do we do? You said he wouldn't do this. How can he be so heartless?" It stung, a little, to hear those words aimed at me. But I held my ground, the weight of the new keys heavy in my pocket. Evan tried calling my phone. Once, twice, 3 times, but I let each ring fall silent, my chest tightening with every missed call. After a few minutes, Brittany noticed the boxes. I watched her approach, her steps tentative as if the porch itself might give way. She opened the first box, her hand shaking. The sight of her dresses, carefully folded, must have landed like a slap. Evan joined her, rifling through shirts and shoes, a watch he'd left behind. He picked up a note I'd left atop the pile. Plain, almost impersonal. "Please collect your belongings by Friday. The locks have been changed." Evan read it aloud, his voice cracking. Brittany's face twisted, somewhere between anger and disbelief, and for a moment I thought she might scream. But instead, she just stood there, shoulders hunched, staring out at the dark street. They lingered on the porch for a long time, Evan pacing, Brittany whispering into her phone, no doubt searching for a friend or a hotel. I imagined their arguments, the blame, the old wounds split open again. I tried not to listen, but even through the glass, I could hear snippets. "This is your fault. You promised he'd never do this. What about Tyler? Where will we go?" A part of me ached for them, for the little family I'd tried so hard to save. But another part, the part that remembered every empty promise, every time I'd been pushed aside, felt only a cold kind of justice. Eventually, they gave up. Brittany dragged a suitcase down the steps, heels clicking like an accusation. Evan paused, looked back at the house, and for a moment, I thought he might break down, might beg. But he squared his shoulders and walked after her, stiff and silent. The cab they'd called pulled up, headlights splashing across the wet street, and the two of them climbed in, leaving the porch, the house, and me behind. I watched them go, my chest hollow and full at the same time. It was over. The war was finished, at least for tonight. But in the quiet that followed, a flood of memories rose up. Evan's first Little League game, his graduation, Gloria's laughter as she set the table for Thanksgiving. They all drifted through the house, familiar and bittersweet. I wondered if I would ever stop loving them, if any father truly could. But love, I realized, did not have to mean surrender. Not anymore. The phone on the kitchen counter buzzed with new messages. Evan's voice, rough and desperate. Brittany's words clipped and raw. "Dad, let us in. We need to talk. Please don't do this." I deleted each one without listening all the way through. Their apologies felt like empty gestures now, another bid for control, another attempt to turn the page back to a time before consequences. I would not give in. Not this time. Sometime after midnight, I sat by the window, lights off, the house dark except for the glow from the street. I listened to the soft patter of rain and let the stillness wrap around me. I thought of Tyler, my grandson, his innocence untouched by all this grown-up betrayal. I promised myself I would reach out to him, somehow explain, somehow show him that boundaries weren't cruelty, but an act of love. The idea comforted me, and for the first time, I felt sleep tug at my eyelids. The next morning, the sun broke through, crisp and golden, glinting off the boxes that still waited on the porch. I made coffee and sipped it slowly, watching the world come to life again. Neighbors walked their dogs, waved as they passed, not knowing or maybe not caring what had happened behind my door. I felt older, yes, but lighter too. The weight I'd carried for so long, of expectation, of disappointment, of endless second chances, had finally begun to lift. It wasn't triumph I felt, not really. It was something closer to relief, and beneath that, a deep, hard-won peace. My story wasn't neat or happy, and the scars wouldn't fade overnight. But for the first time, I was living on my own terms, not as a background character in Evan and Brittany's life, but as the author of my own. I didn't know what would happen next, or whether Evan would forgive me, or if Brittany would ever understand. Maybe Tyler someday would want to hear my side. What I did know was this: whatever happened, I would stand by the choices I'd made. The house felt like mine again, filled not with regret, but with the quiet assurance of a man who had finally learned where to draw the line. The world outside had changed by degrees, growing warmer as May unfolded over the neighborhood. Sunlight lingered a little longer through the kitchen windows now, catching on the rim of my coffee cup and painting gold over the scars in the old table. I moved through my mornings quietly, no longer jumping at the sound of the phone or checking for Evan's name in my inbox. My life had settled into a new kind of rhythm, stripped of expectation and the slow corrosion of hope, but richer in ways I'd forgotten to look for. The house had a different weight these days. The echoes of Evan's childhood laughter, the remnants of arguments and the anxious shuffle of feet in the hallway. They faded but didn't vanish. I learned not to chase them away. I kept his photograph on the mantel, a reminder that even a wounded heart can remember love. I baked pie for the first time in years, the kitchen filling with the scent of cinnamon and sweet apples. Sometimes the taste brought tears to my eyes, the memory of Gloria sitting at this table, her soft voice teasing me about my terrible crust, flitting just out of reach. Yet the grief felt different now. Not gone, but gentle, less like drowning and more like drifting along the current, carried by something bigger than loss. A few days after Evan and Brittany left, I found myself at a corner table in the busy diner down on Maple. Elaine, my neighbor, waved me over, her hair wild from gardening and her smile a splash of sunlight in the gloom. We spoke about everything and nothing. Her roses, a stray dog she'd found, the best spot to watch thunderstorms. I told her about the pie, about how I'd changed the locks, about the boxes on the porch, and she listened with the kind of care you don't find in many people anymore. She never offered judgment, only a steadying presence, like a hand at your back as you walk through fog. She asked if I regretted it. I thought hard before answering. Regret, I realized, was just another way of clinging to the past, to the things we never dared say aloud. I told her I missed Evan, of course. I missed the shape of the family I'd tried to hold together, the feeling that what I did mattered. But I didn't regret the choice to draw a line, to demand that my love not be mistaken for weakness. Elaine smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes, and said nothing more about it. As the days passed, Evan's silence took on a weight all its own. He didn't call. Brittany didn't write. The only sign of them was a package delivered for Tyler, a science kit I'd ordered before Hawaii became a dividing line. I wondered how he'd take it, whether he'd even know where it came from. I wrote a note in careful script, hoping some small kindness would still reach him across the grown-up wreckage of his parents' choices. Maybe one day he'd understand. I wasn't angry at him. I was just trying to protect what little dignity I had left. There were moments, late at night, when doubt came in like a tide, slow and relentless. I'd replay the sound of Evan's fist on the door, the crack in his voice as he read my note. Was I being cruel or just tired of being a bystander in my own life? Sometimes I'd stand at the window, coffee cooling in my hand, and watch the world drift by. Families walked their dogs, children raced bikes, young couples argued about groceries. I'd see myself reflected there, older and grayer, but not defeated. Not yet. One morning, as I was sweeping the porch, a car pulled up and parked a few houses down. For a second, my heart hammered. Some old instinct, the hope that Evan might appear, apology and relief in his step. But it was only the mailman, slow and steady as always. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever see my son again on this street. If any of this would ever make sense to him. If he'd ever understand that drawing a line wasn't about shutting him out, but about saving myself. Days turned into weeks. Elaine came by often, sometimes with pie, sometimes with nothing but a story and a smile. We planted flowers together in the side yard, her hands steady, mine clumsy and out of practice. I found comfort in the routine, in the small rituals of daily life, in the gentle certainty that the sun would rise and set whether or not Evan ever forgave me. The neighbors were curious, of course. People always are. I'd catch them glancing at the porch, lowering their voices when I passed on my morning walks. Some offered sympathy, a few thinly veiled judgment. But mostly they kept their distance, unsure how to approach a man who had lost his family but found his spine. One afternoon, I got a call from Tyler's school. Nothing dramatic, just a reminder about a parent-teacher conference. The secretary asked if I'd like to attend. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure whether I'd be welcome or if Evan and Brittany had already told their version of the story. But something inside me pushed back against that fear. I told her I'd be there. When the day came, I sat in the back of the classroom, watching Tyler build a bridge out of popsicle sticks and glue. He glanced up, surprised but happy to see me, and for a moment, the rift between generations seemed small, almost manageable. I watched him work, remembered Evan at that age, his fierce concentration, his easy laughter. I caught the teacher's eye and she nodded, a silent gesture of understanding. Maybe forgiveness starts with something as small as showing up. Afterward, I walked Tyler to the parking lot. He asked why he didn't see me anymore, why his mom and dad seemed angry all the time. I knelt down, looked him in the eye, and told him that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, that loving someone doesn't mean always saying yes, and that I'd always be there if he needed me. He hugged me hard, and for a second, the world seemed to tilt back toward hope. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the air humming with the soft buzz of cicadas and distant laughter. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe Evan would call. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe Brittany would send another message, or maybe silence would become our new language. I couldn't control what they did, only how I responded. The finality of my choices settled in, but instead of bitterness, I felt a strange gratitude. I was still here. I was still myself. I thought of Gloria, how she would have handled all this, and I smiled. I'd done what I could. I'd held the line even when my hands shook. Some nights, regret tried to claw its way back in, whispering that I'd lost more than I'd gained. But most days the peace was real. I found myself laughing again, finding joy in things I'd forgotten. Homemade bread, old radio shows, the first tomato in the garden. Elaine and I shared dinners, trading stories until the sun dipped low behind the trees. I wrote letters to Tyler, tucked them in with his care packages, letting him know that love could be quiet, steady, and unwavering, even when it didn't look the way he expected. One morning, months later, Evan showed up at the front gate. He looked older, worn down, not by anger but by the slow erosion of certainty. He stood there, hands in his pockets, searching for words. I stepped onto the porch, my heart racing. He looked at me and said, "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but I get it now." The words were rough, unfinished, but I could hear the truth in them. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We sat together for a long time, letting the silence mend what words couldn't. In that space, I realized that forgiveness isn't always a conversation. It's a slow unwinding, a willingness to see each other not as villains or victims, but but as people, flawed and hopeful, always trying to find our way home. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting the yard in gold, I felt the last of my bitterness loosen and fall away. My story was not perfect, but it was mine. I had lost much, but I had kept something too, the quiet, persistent belief that dignity and love do not have to be enemies. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go, and trust that what matters will remain.